Fellas, last night we had Tyson Fury versus Usyk, and it was one of the many big boxing fights we've had this year, and boxing's been doing really well this year in comparison to other years. So I'm going to ask the question, has boxing had a better 2024 so far compared to the UFC? And I know everyone's going to be saying no, UFC has been much better, but to make it fair and try and be as unbiased as possible, I'm going to be going over a few categories to determine what actually has been the better sport. Starting off with the first category, which is big fights. How many big fights has either sport had, and have these fights actually performed? The next category is going to be events. So have the events actually been watchable? Have the events actually been enjoyable, and have they been good? And then the next category is going to be entertainment. So have these cards and fights actually been entertaining, or have they kind of just been dead fights? And then the final category is going to be undercard. So have they actually had a good undercard, or is it completely just main event, main event focused, and has it all just been focused on the main event rather than the card itself? And then I'll do a conclusion at the end to, figure out which one is better. And we'll start off with the first category, which is big fights. So this year, boxing has had a lot more big fights in comparison to other years. I mean, you look at previous years like 2022 and maybe even 2023, there was a lot of critique on boxing. People were saying that boxing is dying. Even I said that at one point, and there was just a lot of hate on the sport of boxing because they weren't doing the best versus the best. We have fights like Tyson Fury versus Derek Chisora, which nobody wanted to see. Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou, which obviously in hindsight wasn't actually that bad, but if you're a boxing fan, you're seeing the heavyweight champion of the world face a guy that's never fought in boxing before. Joshua versus Helenius as well. There was just a lot of fights that instead of it being the best versus the best, it kind of just seemed like a battle of the promoters. What's the biggest cash grab we can make? And now, thanks to the Saudis coming in, we're actually getting to see the best versus the best rather than just what's the biggest cash grab we can make. So boxing's had a lot of clown shows, and then this year they've been doing really well as well. Tyson Fury versus Usyk last night, Garcia versus Haney, Inoue versus Neri, Lomachenko versus Kambosos Jr., Canelo versus Munguia. We've had a lot of big fights in boxing this year, and I feel like we're actually starting to turn up a bit with boxing and actually have the best versus the best. UFC have had the same problem with boxing though, with the best not actually facing the best. Look at John Jones and Stipe. Rather than John Jones, the heavyweight champion of the world, facing the interim champion in Tom Aspinall, who is the best, instead he wants to fight Stipe Miocic, who's 41 years old, hasn't fought in over 3 years, and when he did fight, he was knocked out cold by Francis Ngannou, and that is going to be the next heavyweight fight. And John Jones' last fight was in March of 2023, and now his next fight is going to be in November of 2024. So the heavyweight division in MMA is completely, it's going backwards, to be honest, and that's a problem with MMA. But we've also had some big fights in the UFC this year. We've had Volkanovski versus Topuria, Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Vera, Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis, Max Holloway, Justin Gaethje, Pereira versus Hill, and even scheduled fights that haven't happened yet. Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, the big return of McGregor, Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier, rumored Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis, which is rumored to be UFC 305. So both have had some really good fights this year. I feel like it's difficult to kind of say which one has been better. It kind of just comes down to, are you a fan of either sport? So I'd say they're fairly even when it comes to big fights. UFC have got some big fights scheduled, but boxing have had a lot of big fights this year as well. So I'd say as far as big fights go, they're fairly even, but if I had to give it to someone, I'd say UFC. But I'll say it's fairly even so far. And then the next category is events. So have the events actually been enjoyable, or have they just been completely unwatchable? Now, I have a big problem with boxing events. The big problem I have is the wait time. For boxing, in between each fight, you can expect to be waiting about an hour to an hour and a half in between each fight, which in my opinion is just way too long to be waiting in between each fight. Whereas if you compare that to the UFC, you will have about 30 minutes maximum in between each fight, sometimes even less. Maybe the co-main event and the main event might be a little bit longer, but in between each fight in the UFC, on average, you're probably going to be waiting at most 30 minutes. And then even how long the event goes on for. So in the UK, the Tyson Fury versus Usyk card, it started about 3 p.m, 3:30 p.m, and went all the way up till about 1:30 p.m, whereas in the UFC, the card goes from about 11 p.m. till about 6 a.m. in the UK. So boxing cards, they just go on for way too long. The space in between fights is too long as well, and there's just a lot of unnecessary stuff. These random rappers, these random performers on the card. Nobody paid to see these random ass rappers performing in the middle of a boxing fight while we're waiting for the fights to start. We're not here for that. We're paid to see fights, and that's what I like about the UFC. There's none of that nonsense going on. It's just pure fighting, and you've got enough time to have a break, but it's not too long to the point where you're having to sit there watching these random rappers perform. So event wise, I'm gonna have to give it to the UFC. Much shorter, much less wait time, and much less just unnecessary stuff going on. So events, I'm gonna have to give that to the UFC. And then we'll go on to the undercard. So what has actually had the better undercards between boxing and the UFC? Now, another problem with boxing is I feel like boxing is completely main event focused. So rather than focusing on the undercard, like for example, I'll keep going on about this, Fury versus Usyk. Everyone's focused on the fight between Tyson Fury and Usyk. No one ever mentions the co-main event. No one ever mentions the rest of the fights on the main card. All the attention is just on the main event. And that's a problem with boxing, because in the UFC, if you were to make a big main event and then the rest of the card is garbage, UFC fans ain't going to be happy, even if the main event's really good. If the rest of the card ain't good either, fans ain't going to be happy. I guess Conor McGregor can kind of be an anomaly, because when there's a McGregor card going on, they're not going to have the most stacked cards. But look at UFC 299, 298, UFC 300. The card was stacked from start to finish. You don't get that in boxing. Sometimes you can even have fighters that are like 25-0 taking on fighters that have more losses than they do wins. So undercards, I'm definitely going to have to give it to the UFC. Sometimes boxing can have good undercards and good main cards and whatever, but UFC are definitely better. They have more consistent stacked cards, and it's very rare that you get a UFC card that isn't actually stacked, at least the main card. So undercard, I'm going to have to give it to the UFC. And then we'll go on to entertainment. Now, for entertainment, this definitely just comes down to personal preference. What do you actually like more? But this year, we've had a lot of entertaining moments. Obviously, Fury versus Usyk last night was good. Garcia versus Haney, great fight as well. And in the UFC, we've had some bangers this year. Max Holloway versus Justin Gaethje, Alex Pereira knocking out Jamal Hill. We've had a lot of big fights in the UFC this year. So for entertainment-wise, obviously I'm going to be biased and I'm going to say the UFC, but it kind of just comes down to personal preference. Boxing fans love to critique the UFC. They love to say that they hate grappling. Oh, it's just boring, it's just hugging. But then you can also critique boxing and say that a lot of the fights just tend to be clinch fests. So entertainment really just comes down to personal preference. What do you like more? Do you like watching boxing and the UFC? But they've both been pretty entertaining this year, so it's hard to say, you know, that one beats the other. Another problem I have when it comes to boxing entertainment is I feel like the amount of belts in boxing kind of ruins it. In the UFC, you'll have one belt a weight class. The only difference, or the only thing that separates having one belt a weight class is the two belts, the BMF belt and the interim belt. The BMF belt, I guess you can call it a gimmicky belt, but at least we get good fights. And then the interim belt is kind of just a ticket to say that you're next in line, unless it's the heavyweight division. Whereas in boxing, you usually have about 4 or 5 belts each weight class, which can just be so confusing for, you know, casual boxing fans. And yeah, I just much prefer one belt a weight class. Who is the best in that weight class? Rather than there being about 4 or 5 belts a weight class, it's just super unnecessary. And I feel like it can really ruin the entertainment factor of boxing. But to answer the question, has boxing had a better year than MMA? No, I don't think it has. I think boxing has done really well in comparison to other years in boxing. I feel like if you look at boxing this year and compare it to, let's say, 2022, it's done really well. We're finally getting to see the best versus the best thanks to the Saudis. But UFC, in my opinion, obviously I'm going to be biased, but I feel like it's just been better in every way. The events, the undercards, the big fights, it's a lot more consistent. So I'd say UFC is still better than boxing, but no disrespect to boxing. I feel like there doesn't need to be a debate because boxing has had some good fights this year as well. But let me know your thoughts on boxing. Have they turned up this year? Have they had a lot of good fights this year? And overall, just let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.